Welcome everyone. Today's video will cover assessments, scales, and scoring, how to track progress in Apricot. We're going to be reviewing the different system design and reporting approaches that you can apply to your Apricot system for tracking client assessments and then reporting out on progress and outcomes. My name is Ali Seidel. I'm an Apricot software consultant at Sidekick Solutions. At Sidekick Solutions, we help new and existing users make the most of their Apricot database. We do the heavy lifts of database design and administration so you can focus on what matters most to you. We know that creating accurate and meaningful reports on program outcomes can be a huge challenge, especially when the data you're working from is tracked in paper forms or on multiple data systems that don't sync up. If this sounds like a familiar challenge, the good news is that your Apricot system, if set up well, can truly transform your ability to collect, report out on, and analyze client assessment data, which is why today we're going to spend some time walking through the various approaches we recommend and why. In this video, we will discuss system design considerations when looking to track assessments in Apricot. We're going to explore 4 design styles to tracking assessment data in Apricot, so how to design your forms. And then we're going to show you how 3 primary ways to report on assessment data using Apricot Standard Reports. Okay, so let's get started. The first step in assessment tracking is setting up your form structure and fields in Apricot. Form design is something you really want to get right because how your system is configured impacts user experience and adoption, data structure, and definitely reporting. So when looking to start tracking something new, the goal should always be to design an Apricot system that captures the right data, reinforces accuracy at data entry, and can run reports on that data efficiently using Apricot's standard tools. We recommend blueprinting any new configurations in Apricot before you start building. And when thinking about building a system to track assessments, there are a few considerations you'll want to keep in mind up front. So before you build, think, how are you going to collect and enter the information into the database? This matters because it impacts how your forms and fields must be set up. If you'll be collecting assessments manually, say in paper forms, you'll need staff to manually enter assessment data post-data collection. This is the most flexible option in terms of system design, but it is also the most time-intensive for your users. So if you want to collect assessments in an online format instead, you can do this. Apricot provides you with a number of tools and features to do so, including setting up a secure web form, you can also use the guest login or portal features to directly enter data into Apricot as it's collected. If those online collection tools aren't the right fit, you can also use Apricot's import tool to upload data collected in a third-party system in batches. Second, on what frequency will your assessments be collected? Generally in assessments, we ask the same questions at different intervals so we can compare results. But sometimes we want to compare scores from assessments taken at specific times in the relationship with the participant and possibly exclude others. Say if they were collected at the wrong time or for an interval that is irrelevant for a particular outcome. So be sure each assessment is coded with a date or interval so that you can report on the assessment results you care about and exclude the ones you don't. Next, you want to consider how will you be scoring your assessments. Apricot has several tools for converting qualitative measures and converting them into quantitative results for scoring, allowing you to set up a system that scores your assessments for you. We recommend using masked option fields like drop-downs, radio buttons, and Likert scales for your assessment questions so that you can set up back-end scores while still showing a front-end text value to the person who's actually entering the data. These fields, because they store a back-end value, a numeric value, can then be pulled into calculations to generate subtotals or total assessment scores, either with calculation fields on the form or with special calculation columns in a report. Finally, you want to be sure you pick a form structure that meets your reporting requirements. There are 4 main ways you can design your forms to track assessment data in Apricot, including pre-post assessment, tracking just pre-assessment data and comparing it to post-assessment data, but tracking it in field sets on a single record. Typically, this is a Tier 2 record, like an enrollment form, for example. The second common approach is to track assessments on an activity record. So when you're logging a service, to select an assessment value at the same time. Third is to create an individual assessment Tier 2 form, typically linked back to the enrollment so that you can associate that assessment with the engagement of the client, their enrollment form and data. Fourth is to track an individual assessment on a Tier 1 instead of a Tier 2, and this assessment would be linked to the client profile and also optionally to the enrollment, again, so that you can associate program engagement data with that assessment in a report. So let's dive into each of these one at a time. So let's take a look at the pre and post assessment first. So this is one form. You'd have one record that is updated at pre and post assessment intervals, generally different dates. This approach supports easy comparison of pre and post statuses using calculations. So calculation fields on the form or calculation columns in a report. And it can be implemented with a new section on the enrollment form, or really any form in which you want to do a pre and post assessment. Or it can be its own form that maybe you link from an enrollment, and maybe a wizard link, which is a pop-up menu where you would enter it on that and then close it out. So why would we do this? A pre-post assessment is great at collecting data at an existing client touchpoint, typically at intake and exit. It's also easily reportable specifically on the change from intake to close. You can really easily compare that data in a report because it's one record, so it shows up on one row in your report. It's also easy to chart client progress because you just have those 2 data points to compare. Let's take a look in, we have a sandbox Apricot setup, so let's take a look at that. So we have a demo form set up under a client profile here. Let's open up Anita Fake. And you can see we have a program enrollment and exit. This is where we have our pre-post assessment. And we've set it up as a separate section. So you can see that we have 2 fields tracking at enrollment status, and then we're asking the same measures at exit. And so when we select that status at enrollment and then later selected at exit, we can pull in both of those measures into a report and compare. These are both masked fields, and so on the back end we've assigned values for poor, fair, and good. So when we report on them, we can reference either the numeric value or the text value, depending on what we're hoping to accomplish. So you'll see here, poor is rated 1, fair has a backend value of 2, and good has a backend value of 3. Like I said, this is a masked dropdown. Apricot also gives you the option to add other masked fields. You'll find them under the option field choices category. mask drop-down, mask radio button. The Likert scale is also a masked field that allows numeric backend values. So next, let's talk about tracking assessment data as a supplement to an activity form or record. So this is another situation in which, this is a situation in which you have an existing touch point, just like you have with enrollments, intake and exit. So activity record, by this you typically are going to see this as a service form or maybe an attendance that you're tracking, some type of activity or touch point you already have with a client in which you're trying to log status at the same time you're logging other data. So this supports assessment over time of your participants. So above and beyond the pre and post assessment, you get to track additional data because you're collecting it at a higher frequency than you would be your intake and exit. Just the same as the pre and post assessment format, you can add this to an existing service or activity form in a new section or as a linked form. So maybe you want to set up a separate assessment form and link that to your activity record so that you can fill out the assessment at time of activity, but perhaps have it tracked in a separate record. That's also an option. So like I said, this approach is great because it lets you collect data at existing client touchpoints. You get to chart client progress over multiple dates instead of just 2 data points. And you can report on assessment data by date, interval, service type, really any differentiator that you're tracking on the activity record, you can use to report out and filter down your assessment data as well. So let's take a look at what this looks like in our sandbox system. So this is another form that we already have set up in our client profile. Let's take a look at Anita again here. In this case, we decided to add assessment to our service tracking record. So we're going to open that up. This record, the way we designed it was with form logic, so that if you answered status update yes at the time of service, you'd also select an employment status and a housing status at that same time. These are also masked fields, and so there's backend values assigned to each of these statuses, which allows us to take a quantitative measure at time of service and then compare that over time in a report. Okay, next up, let's take a look at the third approach, which is to track assessments in its own form, an individual assessment form, specifically a tier 2 in a client profile document folder. So this approach is honestly the most scalable. It's going to let you complete assessments on any frequency. You can enter as many assessments as needed, and you can connect it to any other data for that client that you need to. So most commonly, an assessment is going to be linked back to an enrollment form that's tracking the start and end date of that client's enrollment, and as well as what program or other, what program they're engaged with at your organization. And so most commonly, as you'll see in this screenshot, we'll link back to a program enrollment, and then we'll enter the date of the assessment, or in this case a survey, as well as the frequency or interval of that assessment, so that when we run a report, we can say, I want to see, the assessment data for this individual at baseline versus at program exit. You can choose how you're comparing data. Okay, so let's take a look at this demo in Apricot. So Anita also has a separate assessment form. In this database, we're calling it the Arizona Self-Sufficiency Matrix. So this is a separate assessment form that's taken at specific intervals. So the way we have this form set up is that there's specific survey frequency, and so we are planning to have this individual take a survey while they're engaged in our program at baseline, follow up 3 months, and then 3 months after that, and again at 9 months until exit. And then there's an individual question. Each of these, again, have a masked numeric value so that we can compare them over time. Okay. Now the fourth approach is to do what we just described, but on a tier 1. So to set up an individual assessment form to collect assessments. This time, the reason we would use a tier 1 is generally because you want the ability to collect anonymous or log anonymous assessments, or because you want to be able to collect the data online by converting the assessment form into a secure web form. By doing that, we're collecting, you might collect someone's name, but it's not going to be automatically matched to their profile in Apricot. And so there would have to be a post-collection process. So the form would be online. You could share that with a client and they could complete the form, entering their name. But then you would need to see that you would need to have a report where you see that the assessment has come in, and then you would link that assessment back to their existing Tier 1 profile, and then optionally also to their enrollment, so that you can track the data against your client rather than in aggregate anonymously. This is great for post-enrollment follow-up assessments, anonymous surveys, and anything in which you need to track it online or you want an easier, streamlined approach to collecting the data. Now, I do have a caution here. It does require you have to keep a close eye on the data, because anything that's collected online, you're skipping that human data quality review when entering the data. And so there is that risk that something's entered in a way that you didn't want, or obviously there's the gap of needing to connect these Tier 1 assessments up to the client profile. And so you do need to be aware of the data and watching it as it comes into your system. So our demo, a Tier 1 assessment form, is called a financial behavior survey. We've made this a secure online form, secure web form, I should say. And when it comes into the system, when it gets entered into your database, it comes in as a Tier 1. And you'll get, in this case, named Bobby Jenkins. All of your assessment fields are filled out, of course, but the follow-up action is actually to link up to a client profile. So in this case, we've hidden, this is form logic in which this section is hidden when the client fills it out online. But then once the record's saved, it's displayed, and then an admin needs to come in and search for the appropriate client and attach them here. And then save the record. And after that, when we go to our client's profile, we can also look at the assessments associated down here at the bottom. Okay. So no matter the approach that you choose for tracking assessments, there's 3 primary ways to analyze that assessment data when you look towards reporting. So we're going to look at those 3 approaches next. The most common ones that we recommend is to track client progress over time for a specific client. We call this a client summary report. The second is to report out on aggregate client outcomes. So in aggregate, when you look at all of your client assessments that have been collected, or maybe all of them at a specific frequency, reporting out on an average for all clients or total score for all clients, that's what I mean by an aggregate client outcome report. Third is to take a look at the change between assessment scores. There's 2 ways to do this, and we'll get into that when we take a closer look. So let's get started with the client summary report. Charting client progress over time per client allows you to visualize change over time, again, for a single client. So you get more information from a single report in which you can pull in the records that you wish than you would by looking at someone's document folder and then opening their records one at a time. So this is compatible with both the pre-post model, in which data at multiple intervals is entered on one record, as well as the individual assessment form models. And it's going to allow you just to streamline access so that you don't have to go digging through the document folder. So let's take a look at what I mean by a client summary report that charts client progress. So in our system, we've actually set this up to quickly access the report from the bulletin page. So you'll see I have a button here for Run Client Summary Report. I'm going to go ahead and click that. The way this is set up is using global values to search for your clients. And then when you search by name, you'll get a list of clients in this top search section, after which you can see their record ID and enter that in the global value. This is called we call this a custom client record ID search. And then once you've entered a record ID, all of the additional sections you might have set up to look at demographics, contact information, enrollment history, goal status, and in our case, assessments is going to populate. So we're going to look for Bobby Jenkins. Just put in her last name here. Okay, we just have one client by the name of Jenkins in our system, and here's the record ID. So I'm going to enter 7217 in the record ID up top. And now my report's going to reload, and my sections are going to fill out with data. So this is it's a great printable format for a single client. In our case, what we care about for today's video is how do we use this approach to look at, to chart progress for a single client, their assessment progress over time. So we're looking at our Arizona Self-Sufficiency Matrix. It's a Tier 2 assessment record, and for Bobby Jenkins in particular. Now, this report shows me that Bobby Jenkins has 5 different matrices filled out, 5 different assessment records in which she was assessed over this, looks like about over a year's time frame. Now, the way we have this set up is this graph is charting each of these metrics by date. And so on October 2017, this was how she scored for income, employment, shelter, food, and life skills. Now, if we want to see for each metric what her progress is over these multiple dates, this line chart is very helpful for that. So looking at life skills, I can see she's stayed consistent. Food, she's also stayed consistent. Shelter, she's gotten a little bit better, then dropped down and then improved again. Employment, she went up and then stayed stable. So this is a nice way to have a visual look at your client progress for metrics that you're tracking over time. Okay, before we jump out of that demo, I have one other view. When you look at pre-post data, so in this case we also, for Bobby, have program enrollment, intake and exit assessment on her employment and also housing status. So here's an example of charting that change at pre and post using her program enrollment assessments at pre and post intervals. So here we see by program, and we can see that she improved from 1 to 2 from pre to post. Now, actually, if I were to edit this, a key thing to keep in mind when reporting out on masked fields and looking to graph the numeric values is that any metric you pull in, so in this case we're looking at the matrix again, and we have that income field, you'll see, because this is a masked option field, I have a choice to display the value, which is the text, or the stored value, which is the number. And I've intentionally selected stored value so that I can pull in the number, create summaries. Maybe I want to look at averages, minimums, maximums, etc. And once I have the number pulled into my column and displaying, I can then chart that on a graph. So do keep that in mind. Okay, so next, let's take a look at the Aggregate Client Outcomes report. So what can we do to look at aggregate client outcomes? This type of reporting is going to allow you to track program impact, looking at aggregate analytics, so all of your clients or a slice of your clients all in one go. You can chart average results at different intervals, so by date or say a predefined interval like 3 months, 6 months follow-up. And it's going to allow you to measure progress towards specific benchmarks. So we have a demo for this one as well. Let me pull that up. Okay, so when looking at aggregate outcomes, the great thing about this is that you want to filter down to include the assessments that you care about, and then you can graph them. So in this case, we didn't actually filter down. This is demo data, but most likely you would filter down by program on the program enrollment record, or potentially even by interval, or maybe everyone who scored over a certain amount. In this case, we're looking at everybody that's taken this assessment. The great thing about doing it this way is that you can use summary fields. So we've actually summarized each of our metrics, income, employment, shelter, across all of the assessments that done at baseline, and we've averaged them. So we know, looking at all of our assessments at baseline, this is our frequency, our survey frequency, that there was on average at baseline 2.66 score for income. And then we can also see an average per metric at follow-up, 3 months. And because we've grouped this, we can also chart it. And so that's what this chart is doing. It's looking at, it's charting, you probably want to look at it one at a time. So your baseline, these are your average baseline scores. And then when you look at follow-up 3 months, and you can put them back to back if you want to visually compare. So you can pick and choose which ones you're visually comparing. And this is just a visual way to look at your data and see maybe where folks are improving more than in other categories. As you can see, we've also set up a summary section here. This is a section in which we've pulled in, when I switch over to editing view here, I can show you what I've pulled in. This is just an average report section in which I've used special columns to pull in summary columns. So section summary and section counts to then display the total rows in below sections. In this case, I've used this approach to pull in total clients assessed and total number with a total score over 12 at exit, and then calculated how many my benchmark was for folks to score over 12. And so then I'm able to calculate my percentage of folks that met that goal at exit. So this is a great way to calculate percentages, percents of folks that met your goal, or percents of folks that may have improved from the prior assessment. This is a great tool, this summary section, to pull in and calculate that data. Now, finally, let's take a look at our third approach at analyzing this data, which is to take a look at the change. So looking at change in score, and this might be a change in an average score across or a total score at assessment, or it might be looking at a specific metric, but taking a look at the change between one assessment to another. So you can calculate improvement over time with this approach, and you can also summarize key metrics in a report section for easy review, just like we were looking at before. So let's take a look at this demo, which is actually the same report we were looking at. We've just built additional sections here to report out on improvement. So this is our first example, this pre-post enrollment goal status section. And looking at this, what we've done is calculated the change between scores at pre and at post. So we've pulled in the pre-employment status for all of our assessments here, as well as the post-employment status. And then we've used a calculation column, in fact, a subtraction calculation column to calculate the change. So we can see here for Anita that she improved by 1 point between her two statuses. And then we also used another field here to count, to tell us if someone improved or not, and then count that up in a summary. So we can see that out of all of our clients here, only two of these assessments showed improvement from pre to post assessment. Now we can also pull these numbers into the summary section to see a percent of clients that improved employment from intake to exit. So we did this by pulling in total improved, which was that count I showed you we calculated in a column. So total number of improved, and then divided that by the total number of clients assessed. And that's how we got our improved 67%. So you can take a similar format here to find percent improved. Okay, now what do you do if you've tracked your assessment scores on different records? The default in Apricot when you've tracked data on separate records is actually that you have 1 row per record. And so it makes it a little bit harder to calculate something like change between scores because those scores are tracked on separate rows when really you want them in separate columns. So there is a way to do this in Apricot, and it's called limits and aliases. At least those are the tools. So actually, let's edit this report. Take a look at how this is set up. So limits and aliases allow you to pull 2 separate records and look at them side by side in a single row. So for the self-sufficiency matrix, in order to set a limit, I select the form in the form list and set a limit. In this case, I set it to last created. And then I can also set an alias, which is done down here, pressing the plus sign, in which case I chose this to be a prior. I wanted to compare my most recent record or assessment, which was I chose by last created, to the prior assessment. I could also use this to compare most recent to first created. That's another way to do, maybe I want to look at change between intake and exit rather than most recent to prior. But in this case, we did last to prior. Once you've defined that, you typically need to publish your report to get it all refreshed. But after you've done that, you can pull in the alias data. So setting the limit sets your entire report to only show results for the 1 row per client instead of all of their Arizona self-sufficiency matrices, just the most recent one. And so you'll get that most recent result, and then you need to pull in the prior by modifying a column and selecting under form info that you want to pull in the prior created results. So in this case, we pulled in income twice, and then one of them we set to prior created. And that's going to allow us to look at, this first column is going to be last created results, and then the second column is prior created. And we can see that in the run screen. So for Anita here, her most recent income was 3. On her prior created assessment, it was also 3 for income. So she had 0 change. Again, we used a subtraction calculation column here to calculate and then count it up here if it was a positive number. So even when you have tracked scores across multiple records, you can still calculate averages as well as average change between metrics, and then even calculate percentages of, show me how many people improved between intervals that you're comparing. Okay, So let's take a look at some other considerations when you're thinking about tracking assessments, and then wrap up with our key takeaways. So first off, there are a few other features we haven't talked about yet today that can come in handy if you're looking to take your assessment tracking to the next level. One of those is actually specific to reporting. So there's a feature in Apricot called outcomes reporting, and we'll take a look at that. Then when it comes to system design, you might want to consider dynamic fields. This is something that comes with Apricot 360 subscriptions only. And then also, again, for reporting, custom report expressions can be a really great tool. Again, this is just for Apricot 360 subscribers. So let's talk about each of these individually. So first off, what is outcomes reporting? So this is something that's available with all Apricot licenses. Enabling outcomes in a report section allows you to set a benchmark and then see if a row count, group count, or summary total matches that benchmark. So the outcomes tool can add a met, unmet status, which you'll see here. Oops, whoops, I went to the wrong page. Let's hop back here. So you'll see here for Nick Smith, corporate success is unmet. So this shows unmet if his grouping here didn't meet that benchmark, or met if it did. We can also add a progress bar and then have or a check box. There's a check or sorry, what do you even call these? An X mark or a check mark. Those are other ways to visually display if someone has met your benchmark or if the results in your report have met that benchmark. So this would be a nifty tool for visualizing benchmark and measuring against benchmarks, and definitely should be something to explore and see if it works for you. So next up is dynamic text fields. These can be really helpful to pull. You can use dynamic text fields when you build a form. So that on a record entry, you can actually reference a prior record. So in this use case, which you can see in the screenshot here on the right, we used dynamics text fields, which is this first field here listed, to pull in what the housing situation was on the last created record of this type. And then we can reference that when we're selecting the current housing situation. So a use case like this can be helpful when tracking assessment data if you're looking to compare. It means that your users don't have to go into into their systems and dig through the document folder to get this information. They can see it all on a single record. This also eliminates the needs for limit reporting to report on a change between records. So if you don't feel comfortable using limits and aliases, but might want to lean into this dynamic text approach, this is something to explore. So next up and finally is custom report expressions. This is a really nifty tool that if you have Apricot 360, I highly encourage you to explore. You can use it for assessments to turn qualitative data into quantitative scores. You can also use it to prompt action with links to a record or folder. This is what I've demoed here in these screenshots. This client profile is actually a link, and we set that up with custom report expressions, which you'll see here in the column properties. And finally, it's a great tool for counting up records by custom rules in a summary section or multiple criteria in a single section without requiring one section per count you're looking to generate. Okay, so as we look to wrap up, there are a few things that we hope you'll take away with you today about implementing assessments in your own system. So first off, as you can see, there's many ways to design Apricot to collect and report on assessments. So it's important to consider your reporting and user experience requirements before building forms. Secondly, Apricot offers versatile scoring features on forms and in reports to support measurable data collection and reporting. So definitely lean into those. And then finally, Apricot reports are powerful. And if you saw things today that you aren't using yet, I'd encourage you to explore them, look into maybe some training, because exporting to Excel shouldn't be something you need to do on a regular basis. You really, for most use cases, should be able to use Apricot Standard Reports to develop something that's that doesn't need to be exported for further manipulation. And if you do find yourself doing that on a regular basis, I'd encourage you to seek out training or potentially look into whether a system design or some form changes might fix some of the limitations you're finding in reporting. Well, with that, we've come to the end of our video. So to learn more about Apricot, you can explore our YouTube channel or visit our website. And also, if you liked what you saw today, if you like our approach to Apricot and want to explore working with us, please do send us an email. You can reach us at info@sidekicksolutionsllc.com. Our door is always open. So thank you.